The night was thick with tension from the moment I rang the doorbell. Ben Dover opened it, and the man I remembered from my teenage years had only grown more magnetic. His gaze lingered too long, his presence commanding in a way that left me breathless. Susan, his wife, was beautiful, but that only made the forbidden pull between Ben and me more intoxicating. Every glance, every accidental touch felt like a spark igniting something dangerous. By the time he offered to drive me home, the air was electric. When he said, "I know a place," I just closed my eyes and let the night take us. Hi, I'm 20 years old. My story goes back to the pandemic days. My dad got sick, and we found ourselves drowning in debt. I was in college at the time, but the weight of our financial situation made me consider dropping out to find a full-time job. My family was against it. My mom worked long hours, and thankfully, we received some help from our church. Church members hired me as a babysitter to help with expenses, which gave me a way to contribute without leaving school entirely. One evening, a couple requested my babysitting services. The man's name caught my attention immediately, Ben Dover. It sounded so familiar, and then it clicked. I knew him from church when I was about 13 years old. Back then, my friends and I used to joke that he was the most handsome man in the congregation. He had this effortless charm, a presence that was hard to ignore. But Ben had left town about 6 years ago, and the last I'd heard, he was married with twin boys who are now about 4 years old. I'd seen his name pop up in whispers and rumors since he returned, but I hadn't actually seen him. Now, the thought of meeting him again, this time as a babysitter, sparked a strange curiosity in me. He must be around 40 now, but I couldn't help wondering if he was still as captivating as I remembered. When I arrived at their house that evening, it felt almost surreal. The home was modest but elegant, with a warmth that suggested a happy family lived there. I rang the doorbell, and a few moments later it opened. And there he was. Ben Dover stood in the doorway, more handsome than I could have imagined. Time had only sharpened his features, the strong jawline, the piercing blue eyes, the way his smile could melt the coldest of hearts. For a second, I forgot how to breathe. "You must be Nicole," he said, his voice smooth and rich, with a hint of surprise. "Wow, it's been years. You've grown up." I managed a shy smile, my cheeks burning as I stepped inside. The silence was awkward as we waited for his wife. I could feel Ben's eyes on me, scanning me in a way that made my skin prickle. I wasn't sure if I should feel flattered or uncomfortable, but a small part of me couldn't help but enjoy the attention. Just as I was starting to fidget, his wife, Susan, walked into the room. She looked about 30, with long, flowing hair and striking features. She was the kind of beautiful that made you feel instantly self-conscious, effortlessly elegant in a way I could only dream of. In that moment, I thought to myself, I could never compete with her. But Susan wasn't cold or intimidating. She was sweet and polite, handing me a list of instructions for the boys before saying goodbye. Then they left, and I was alone with the twins. The night passed quickly. The twins were adorable and surprisingly well-behaved. I put them to bed without any trouble and spent the next couple of hours quietly reading while they slept. When Ben and Susan returned, they thanked me warmly. Susan went upstairs to check on the boys while Ben lingered in the living room. "I'll drive you home," he offered casually, grabbing his keys. Before I could respond, he was already holding the door open for me. The car ride was quiet at first, but then Ben broke the silence. "You've really grown up," he said, glancing at me briefly before focusing back on the road. "I mean, wow, you're stunning. I can't believe how much you've changed." His words caught me off guard, and my cheeks flushed. I looked out the window, trying to hide my reaction, but he kept talking. "So, do you have a boyfriend?" he asked, his tone light but laced with curiosity. "Someone lucky enough to be with you?" I hesitated. "No, I don't." He smiled, and there was something about the way he looked at me that made my heart race. Hard to believe. "A girl like you must have guys lining up." I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt uneasy, but another part, the one that couldn't ignore how attractive he was, felt flattered. The idea that someone like him could see me that way was thrilling, even if it felt wrong. As the conversation continued, I found myself relaxing, even enjoying his attention. I tried to keep things light. My mind betrayed me. I started imagining scenarios I had no business thinking about. Us walking along the beach, his hand brushing mine, his lips. I caught myself and shook the thought away, my cheeks burning. I couldn't believe where my mind had wandered, but it was too late. The seed had been planted. By the time we reached my house, I could barely look at him. I muttered a quick thank you and hurried inside, my heart pounding. But that night, lying in bed, my thoughts refused to settle. The way he'd looked at me, the things he'd said, it all played over and over in my mind. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I started fantasizing about him constantly, imagining scenarios that made me blush just thinking about them. It was like a switch had been flipped, and now I was obsessed. I didn't want to admit it, not even to myself, but deep down I knew, if I ever had the chance, if the opportunity presented itself, I wouldn't hesitate. The following week, Ben called me again. I couldn't hide my excitement. Not only would I earn some money, but I'd get to see him again. When I arrived at their house, Ben greeted me at the door with his usual warm smile. "Susan isn't feeling well," he said, his voice softer than usual. Just as he spoke, Susan appeared in the doorway, looking pale and tired. Despite her condition, she greeted me kindly. "I'm sorry, Nicole," she said with a weak smile. "I'm not feeling great tonight, but we'll stay in and let you watch the kids while we relax. I don't want to ruin your night or waste your time." The arrangement didn't bother me. If anything, it seemed like the perfect compromise. I'd still get paid, and I'd have the added bonus of being around Ben. The evening passed uneventfully at first. The twins, as usual, were sweet and easy to handle. They fell asleep about an hour after dinner, leaving me with nothing to do but sit quietly in the living room. Susan, feeling a little better, joined Ben on the couch, and they started watching a movie. I busied myself tidying up, but eventually, I couldn't resist slipping into the room to steal glances at Ben. Susan's energy quickly faded. Halfway through the movie, she curled up on the couch, resting her head on a pillow, and within minutes, she was fast asleep. I stood by the door for a moment, debating what to do, before finally gathering the nerve to sit on the couch next to Ben. He glanced at me briefly, a small smile playing on his lips. My heart pounded as I worked up the courage to make my next move. I didn't know what came over me, but something about the quiet, the intimacy of the dimly lit room, and the proximity to him made me bold. I leaned in slightly, catching his gaze as he turned to me again. My eyes held his, and I gave him a playful, teasing smile. Then, without thinking, I raised a finger to my lips, signaling him to be quiet, and leaned in. I pressed a soft, lingering kiss to his mouth. The moment felt like an eternity. When I pulled back, I saw the expression on his face, shock, a flicker of fear, but unmistakably desire. His lips parted slightly as if to say something, but no words came out. I could feel the tension between us, so thick it was almost suffocating. His eyes darted to his sleeping wife, then back to me. "Nicole," he whispered, his voice strained, unsure. I held my breath, waiting to see what he'd do next. Ben's eyes flickered towards Susan, still sound asleep on the couch, her breathing steady and oblivious. His gaze returned to me, his lips parted slightly as though he were about to speak, but decided against it. I felt my pulse quicken, a mix of exhilaration and fear coursing through me. The possibility of being caught only heightened the intensity of the moment, making every glance, every movement feel more forbidden. Ben shifted slightly closer, his arm brushing mine in what seemed like a casual motion, though the contact sent a jolt through me. I couldn't stop myself from leaning in just enough to make the space between us shrink. His eyes searched mine, a storm of conflicting emotions, hesitation, desire, guilt, all swimming beneath the surface. My heart raced as his hand brushed against mine, lingering for a beat longer than it should have. We stayed there, on the edge of something we couldn't take back. Neither of us spoke. Words would have shattered whatever this was, whatever line we were precariously dancing on. And yet, the silence spoke volumes. The heat between us was undeniable, the thrill of the forbidden pulling us both in. Suddenly, Susan stirred slightly in her sleep, a faint sigh escaping her lips. Ben and I froze. The moment was fleeting, but enough to jolt us back to reality. Ben exhaled softly, leaning back ever so slightly, his gaze filled with a mix of longing and restraint. I stayed seated for a moment longer, my mind racing, before quietly standing and retreating to the kitchen, my skin still tingling from the charged closeness we had just shared. Whatever had just happened, I knew this was far from over. Finally, Susan stirred awake, her movements slow and drowsy. She glanced at the clock on her phone and, still half asleep, murmured, "Ben, it's late. You should take Nicole home." Ben and I exchanged a glance, one of urgency and unspoken understanding. Neither of us said much as we grabbed my things and quietly left the house. As soon as the door closed behind us, the tension that had been simmering inside threatened to boil over. In the car, Ben broke the silence. "I know a place," he said, his voice low and deliberate. I nodded, trusting him without question, and closed my eyes as we drove, the hum of the engine blending with the rapid beat of my heart. When we stopped, I opened my eyes to find us in a deserted parking lot, surrounded by darkness. I barely had time to process where we were before Ben leaned toward me, and the tension that had been building all night finally snapped. Heat enveloped us, thick and all-consuming. His lips crashed against mine, urgent and unrestrained, and I felt every inch of my body come alive. The air inside the car quickly grew humid, the windows fogging with every breath, every touch. The faint scent of leather mingled with something warm and earthy, his cologne, his skin, and it wrapped around me, intoxicating and irresistible. His hands roamed, confident and deliberate, leaving trails of fire wherever they lingered. My own fingers gripped at his shirt, pulling him closer, desperate for more. The confined space of the car only heightened the intensity, every movement, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. The creak of the seat, the soft rustle of clothing, the shared gasps of breath, it was a symphony of pure, unfiltered desire. The warmth between us grew unbearable, beads of condensation forming on the glass as the car seemed to close in around us, cocooning us in our shared heat. Every touch, every whispered word, every glance was electric, charged with a passion that felt almost primal. The world outside no longer existed. There was only this moment, this connection, raw and undeniable. Time felt irrelevant. It could have been minutes or hours, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was the pull between us, the way we moved together, the way we let go of everything but the need to feel, to be consumed. When it was over, the windows were opaque with fog, the air thick and heavy with the mingled scent of sweat, skin, and something indefinable, something uniquely ours. We sat there for a moment in the aftermath, our breaths uneven, the silence filled with the echoes of everything we had just unleashed. I didn't want to leave that car. I didn't want to face what came next. But for now, in that fleeting pocket of time, nothing else mattered. As Ben drove me home, the weight of what had just happened settled over us. The silence in the car was thick, and his knuckles tightened on the steering wheel as he finally spoke. "This was a mistake," he said, his voice low and heavy with guilt. I hesitated before replying, knowing what I should say, but also knowing what I felt. "It was a bad idea," I said softly, glancing at him. "You're married, and Susan, she's so good. She doesn't deserve this." Ben nodded, his jaw tense, but he didn't say anything else. The rest of the ride was quiet, but inside, my thoughts raced. I should have felt worse, I knew that. But the truth was, I didn't feel as guilty as I should have. If anything, the fact that Ben, a married man with such a beautiful wife, had been drawn to me only made the whole thing more intoxicating. When he dropped me off, I thought it was the end. A part of me was relieved. Another part was already missing the thrill of his attention. I convinced myself I wouldn't hear from him again. But 3 weeks later, the phone rang. Ben had called my house and spoken directly to my mom, asking if I could become their regular babysitter for 3 to 4 days a month. I was stunned. When my mom told me the news, I couldn't hide the smile spreading across my face. The butterflies returned, along with the fantasies that had refused to leave me since that night in the car. The first time I saw him again, the air between us was just as charged, though neither of us acknowledged it. Susan greeted me warmly. She was everything a wife should be, kind, beautiful, and gracious, but I couldn't stop myself from wanting more with Ben. And the way he looked at me when Susan wasn't watching told me he felt the same. I know what we're doing is wrong. I know Susan doesn't deserve it. I don't think I can control my impulses or Ben's. As much as I tell myself I should walk away, I know I won't. Because no matter how forbidden, how dangerous this is, it's also the most exhilarating thing I've ever felt.